Okay, it looks like we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Constitution 101, this study session, which is the first one of five we're going to have. Well, first, welcome, everybody. We're going to try to wait a little bit until I see people are joining, some people that were waiting for the live stream to start. So we'll start by introducing ourselves, and that'll give people some time to join as well. I'm Juan Davalos. I am a graduate student here at Hillsdale College. I'm about in my fifth year of graduate studies now and writing a dissertation at the moment. Um, so I guess we're considered pretty knowledgeable on this topic. I wouldn't say we're experts because we're nowhere near close the knowledge that people that you've seen in your lectures are, like Dr. Arn and Dr. West. But we'll try to do our best to answer the questions that you've submitted.
Yeah, my name's Bruno. I'm also a graduate student. I'm also writing a dissertation. Me and Juan are kind of interchangeable in that way. Uh, I'm also teaching a class on American foreign policy right now. And what else? Well, I mean, we're broadcasting from Hillsdale College
Hillsdale
in
College.
Hillsdale, Michigan,
That's right.
circa 1945. Uh, the Allies have just won. It's a great year to be alive.
It does feel like that. Well, anyway, so we're gonna go ahead and jump right in now that some of you have already joined us, and talk about some of your comments. I wanted to start with this um, really great comment that was posted in the discussion board online. Um, as as all of you probably know, you have the option to go to the discussion board from the Hillsdale online courses. And one of the comments made by Consuelo Martinez, I thought was very good in answering the question of why she's taking the course. And I just wanted to start with that because um, it was such an encouraging comment. She said, "I need this course as a refresher to revive in me the profound respect I once had for our amazing founders and early leaders, to rekindle the pride for my country with all of its short givings. After all, we are not God, and that through having dominion of knowledge of our historical documents and writings of our forefathers, I can be a trusting messenger to my children and grandchildren in these challenging times our nation is facing. I will not lose hope in this United States of America." I thought that was beautiful. I'm really encouraged by everybody that's taking this course. Uh, we all live very busy lives, and to take the time to look at the lectures, to think about these things, to read some of the materials that you've been asked to read, and to be tuning in right now. It's encouraging to see people wanting to learn more about the Constitution. I do think it's a beautiful document, and as you will go along this course, you will see how um, it really was in a way divinely inspired, how uh, everything came together, and how good the American political thought, the theory of the American government is. In there's reasons for it. These things didn't happen just because they happened. So I wanted to start with that comment, but then we'll go ahead and jump right into some of the questions and the lectures that were presented. Do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree. That's a pretty inspirational comment, and uh, that that's true. This is hard, not least because, as you'll find out over the course of the lectures, um, the country that you're studying was a very different one than it is now, and you can't always take words and ideas for granted. So, words like liberty, like equality. Um, they meant very different things than what we consider them to mean now. And in a way, it's kind of hard because on the one hand, it's your country, but in order to get a good grasp of it, it's almost more useful to think of it in terms of a foreign country. Like you're studying a different time, but also a different place, uh, and that I think might be a little helpful in keeping it keeping the proper distance and kind of the proper sense of, well, what is it that they what is it that they mean here by liberty, by equality? Because we ended up getting a lot of questions about that. And most of them can be answered with what you mean by liberty is not what they meant by liberty, or, equality or something like that.
Right.
So I figure we would start with like a short review because I know some of you may not have actually listened to the lecture in maybe a week or two. So the, there were two lectures, right? The first one by Dr. Arnn on the theory of the Declaration and the Constitution, and the Central American Revolution. And as Dr. Arnn pointed out, Declaration and Constitution have two different functions. The Declaration expresses the purpose of government. The Constitution expresses how government is supposed to work. Right? When it's used in a political sense, the word Constitution here means the established form of government for a state or the nation as a whole in our case, and it's established by the people as a body politic, which we'll get to shortly. Right? It's an agreement by the whole community where each one binds himself to the community and the community binds itself to each one so that everyone in that community can be governed by certain laws and regulations for the common good. And we also think of it as the fundamental law because it's the foundation of every other law, of all of the powers of the state, legislative, executive, judicial. So that, I think, is why Dr. Arnn began where he did. It establishes a republican form of government, which is the one that we, from experience, have come to think of as being the one that promotes our liberties the best, our liberties and the general welfare. Right. So under a very good and wise dictator, your property, your person might actually be protected. Society might actually be prosperous, but the kind of wisdom and the goodness that's required to do that is actually pretty rarely found in either one person or a group of people. And so we are of the opinion as a country that the purpose of government is usually best secured by a written constitution founded on the consent of the governed. And each state has its own constitution. The nation has one. Dr. Arnn went into the characteristics, 3 branches, limited to delegated powers, so on. Lecture 2 was the more theoretical one, where Dr. West starts talking about the law of nature and nature's God.
Right. Am I going to that?
Yeah, take it up.
So I wanted to review a little bit that, especially the state of nature, because that I think that is the most important concept that one needs to understand the political theory of the founders. And Dr. West mentioned this in the lecture that the talk of state of nature and natural rights was uh, prevalent in the founding, beginning in the 1710s. And I think that was one of the questions in the quizzes that you probably took after watching the lecture. It really was everywhere. If you go read even sermons, pastors were preaching sermons in which they would talk, they would they would develop the theories of John Locke in detail. It's incredible to read some of these sermons, and they would talk about state of nature and the law of nature and natural rights and consent and freedom. And so I wanted to go into that because it's important. And so let's start with the state of nature. So what is the state of nature? When they talk about the state of nature, it's just the state in which every individual is in when there is no civil authority, when there is no government over you. And so suppose that you would take I don't know, a spaceship and fly, right? Because everywhere in the country, in the planet now, there are governments. But if you would go somewhere, a planet where there is no government um, over you, then you would be in a state of nature because you wouldn't have any civil law, any governing authority to tell you what to do. But if you're in this place and you're by yourself or just with a few other people, it would still be wrong to take somebody else's property to steal or to kill another person. And that's because in that state of nature, there is still a law of nature, or you would say the law of God, a moral code. And so that's what the founders were talking about, and they believed that when if they would break the political ties with the British Empire, that they would be in a state of nature, and they would have to form a government. And so, because in a state of nature, you can't protect your rights, or it's difficult to protect your rights, because just think about it. If you're an individual and there's no government, and let's say like myself, I'm in my 30s, and I'm uh, I'm fairly strong, but there's a lot of people much stronger than I am. If this 250-pound muscled guy comes and wants to take my computer away from me, I don't have a lot of recourse to stop him from doing that, right? So that person is going to be able to take that away from me, and what can I do if that person's stronger than me? So that's how rights get violated in a state of nature. And so what people do in order to prevent that and is to get together and you say we're going to form an agreement, we're going to form a compact, a contract, and that's what um, political philosophers call a social contract or a social compact. So it's a group of people that get together and say, okay, how do we protect our rights? How do we make sure that our rights are protected? And so we get together and we form a government. And so that government, then the first duty of that government is to protect your rights. That is the reason you form that government. Um, and so that is essential, because if you think about it, in that state of nature, when you're just an individual, nobody can rule you without your consent. And so you see, that's where consent comes in, which is very important for the founders, because if you can't be ruled without your consent, that means that you are giving your consent to this governing authority that you're forming with other people, um, in that they can only govern you because you are giving your consent. Um, I'm not sure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think it does. Mr. Chandler asks whether or not the Magna Carta is the Constitution, um, or a Constitution. I would say that our Constitution is actually more radical than the Magna Carta, because, as far as I know, the Magna Carta um, grants rights to certain people, right? British aristocrats, barons, things like that. But the principles inherent in social compact theory, the laws of nature, says that everyone has natural rights that government is bound to protect. Right? And Juan was talking about the purpose of government being the protection of everyone's rights. Um, Government has to have the power to do that. Right? We got a question either on the discussion board or the email, asking us to talk about the difference between limited government and powerless government, right? And when you talk about limited government in the founding, the founders didn't mean that limited government was weak government. Government was supposed to be strong in its proper sphere, but not involved at all anywhere else, right? The intention was to have the greatest possible degree of personal liberty, as much of the personal liberty that you have in the state of nature as possible. Uh, but consistent with the security of everyone else, right? So government enforces criminal law. It protects people against smaller injuries to person, property, by allowing you to sue for damages, right? It establishes the terms of property ownership. All of those ways in which government is actually quite strong, and all to that purpose of protecting the rights that you have by virtue of the fact that you are a human being, right? Not, an English baron or something to that effect. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah. And so that goes to the point of equality. Then I think it's the next point, which was it's a subject that was brought up a lot in the comments, and some questions in the emails, because um, and this actually comes also from Locke. The founders are drawing their understanding of equality from John Locke, because the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. Now, first of all, when they use the word men, they don't mean males. They're actually kind of careful. The founders are careful in doing this. If they're going to refer to the different genders, they're gonna typically call them male or female. But when they use the word men, that's something that we've lost a little bit nowadays. But they are referring to human beings, and so they say all men are equal. But if you think about that, it doesn't seem like all human beings are equal, right? I mean, you look at Bruno and I, uh, we're different. You know, think about people in your life. Some that are strong, some that are weak, some that are smarter than others. There's a lot of difference between human beings. So what do they mean when they say that all human beings are equal? And the equality is that nobody can be ruled without their consent. That's the equality uh, between all human beings that the founders are talking about. So we need to be careful um, in understanding equality in the way they understood it, because in that sense, what equality means is that the government needs to treat every single person equally. They can't have favorites. They can't play favorites. They can't treat one person, you know, make laws for just one person, but those laws don't apply to a different person. So that's an important understanding of equality. And um, the obvious question I think that follows from that, and we did have some questions through email about that, is well, what about women and African Americans? Obviously, the founders didn't treat them equally. There was slavery at the time of the founding. Um, you'll hear more about this, about the question of slavery. I think it's in lecture 4. Kevin Porteous will talk a lot about this, about the development of that. So I'll just touch on it briefly right now, because actually the founders did include, um, when they were talking about uh, blacks, they thought blacks were human beings and equal. And actually, they all the founders, all the prominent founders, condemned slavery very strongly. I'll recommend this book for you guys. It's Vindicating the Founders by Dr. West, who actually gave the second lecture. That's the cover. And here he quotes extensively founders. I'll read you some of the quotes about what the founders said about slavery, so that you can see that they actually thought slavery was wrong. And so we'll get to then, well, where's the contradiction in a minute. But so, for example, George Washington said, there's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. John Adams said, every measure of prudence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total ex- extirpation of slavery from the United States. I have, through my whole life, held the practice of slavery in abhorrence. Benjamin Franklin, slavery is an atrocious debasement of human nature. And then Hamilton has a similar statement. Madison says the same thing. So they all saw slavery as something that was contrary to the principles of the founding. They understood it was wrong. Jefferson, in the Notes of the State of Virginia, says that he trembles for his country because he knows that God is just and that his justice won't sleep forever. And he was talking about slavery. Um, I think the problem, and again, I'll just touch on this because Dr. Porteous will talk about this more. Uh, Jefferson says we have the wolf by the ears. So think about that mental picture, right? So he's calling slavery like the problem that they have with slavery, that they think that slavery is wrong, but they have slaves like a wolf, like holding a wolf by the ears, that you can't safely let the wolf go, but you can't hold on forever because something's going to happen. It's going to be bad. There was a revolt in Haiti right at the same time, in which the slaves revolted and basically massacred all the whites in Haiti, or at the time I think it was Santo Domingo. And so the founders were very, they were looking at that, and they were scared of that because they said okay, what happens if we do in fact free all the slaves? What's going to happen is they might revolt and they might kill us all. But at the same time, it's wrong to have slaves, so we should free them. But you also have to have considerations. Okay, if you free all the slaves right now, uh, what's going to happen? They need jobs, they need lodging, they need. So there's a ton of considerations that need to be taken place. Obviously, they thought slavery was wrong, but they believed that the best way to get rid of slavery was to put things in motion that would get rid of it in time. And so, again, we're going to talk about that more with Dr. Porter's lecture. So I'll stop at that point there. But just to give an example, there's this huge misconception that blacks and women were not allowed to vote at the time of the founding. That's actually wrong. There are states in which blacks and women voted. In New Jersey, women were allowed to vote in New Jersey. So that's actually a misconception. And again, if you go to this book, Vindicating the Founders, Dr. West has a chart of all the places where people were voting and all the voting laws in the different states that you can see. So I would recommend. I really recommend this book. But anyway,
No,
yeah,
yeah, the case of women is similar to those of blacks. That in principle, there was nothing that prevented women from being able to vote. In the same way that, in principle, there was nothing that prevented blacks from being full citizens and being able to vote. So much so that, yeah, women were allowed to vote in New Jersey in the 1790s and early 1800s. There was a brief period of time where women throughout the United States were not allowed to vote, but that had more to do with their understanding of the different roles that men and women occupy. Um, so women and men were increasingly understood to have equal importance, right? Because everyone has um, equal natural rights, but they have different roles in the family and in society. Right? So your duties and your roles weren't necessarily the same. In the minds of both sexes, from what I can tell during this time, people thought that the best protection of the natural rights of women and children wasn't something that you would find in the ballot box by voting or through legal rights, but in protecting the integrity of the family, which was regarded as basically the core institution of a free society. And whether they were right or wrong about this is subject for debate, right? But they thought the goal was supported by laws giving males a more prominent role than women in positions of formal leadership, both inside and outside the family. So internally, the husband was legally the head of the family, which meant that he would have the final word on where the family would live, things like that. Um, and so in the political world, they have the exclusive right to vote, to serve on juries, and things like that. But women had, almost absolute authority within the home and found most of their protection within the integrity of the family. So, divorce laws were famously very, very strict back then. And that was not only for the sake of the men, but also for the sake of the women. Men just can't pick up and leave. So I don't know. Would you add anything to that?
yeah. I would just add that things in politics also take time to change. You might have you might come to the realization of an idea, and that will take some time in order to change. So one of the things that Dr. West points out in his book is that at least for males, the American electorate grew from about 65% in colonial days to about 85 to 90% in the 1790s. The states were well on their way to their universal adult male citizen suffrage that was nearly accomplished by the 1820s. So, so things were changing. But this does bring up about a point since we're talking about voting, and it's the difference between state governments and federal government. And I think that's a difference that we've lost today because we just think so much about the federal government and we think so much about how things are today that we forget that things were actually a little different back then. Back then, the states saw themselves much more um, as states rather than as a country. And so when people were, people would consider themselves not an American but a Virginian, or or a Georgian, or from different states. And the Constitution actually doesn't forbid really. It doesn't have almost anything about voting. If you would pick up your copy of the Constitution, the only thing that the Constitution says about voting, and this is the federal Constitution, is in Article 1, Section 2. It's talking about the House of Representatives, and it says that for the House, the electors in each state shall the requisite of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So basic, and that's it. That's all that the Constitution back then, when it was ratified, says about voting. And basically, all it says is if you can vote for the House in your state, then you can vote for the House in the federal election. That's it. It's up to the states who votes. It's not up to the federal Constitution. If the states allow everybody to vote, then everybody can vote. If the states allow just a few people to vote, then only a few people can vote. So it's much more of a state issue than a federal issue as it is today. It's not until the um, 14th Amendment that citizenship becomes a federal matter. Back in this time, citizenship was a state matter. The states decided who were citizens and who were not citizens. And remember, in this time for the Senate, people didn't vote for senators. Senators were elected by legislatures. And when you think about the president, the way the president is elected is through the electoral college. And back then, the same. Who decides who the electors are for the electoral college? Each state decides that whichever way they want. Some states had popular vote. Other states had the legislature decided who the electors were. Um, so those are things that have changed from when the Constitution was ratified to today that we have to keep in mind, and keep in mind that for at least for the federal Constitution, uh, the only qualification for voting was, can you vote in your state? If you can vote in your state, then you can vote in the federal Constitution.
Right.
Um, I think, let me see if we have any questions that have come up in the chat. Oh, actually, there was a really good question by Glenn, who emailed um, his question that I wanted to touch on because I thought it was really good. So Glenn sent an email. Sorry, it's not Glenn, it's Gene. Gene sent an email, and he said that this week's lecture raised for me a question about representation. And he says, I would think that since everyone must make a choice to join the social compact, so remember, we were talking about if you're in the state of nature, you get together with a group of people because you want to protect your rights. You form a social compact, and everybody, it has to be unanimous. Everybody has to agree to form the social compact. And that's how uh, a compact is formed. So he says, if everyone must make a choice to join the social compact, on reaching the age of majority, you should need some sort of assent procedure. Um, it is assumed, however, that everyone who is a citizen is automatically included. So that's an interesting point because when you never really assented to be part of a part of the United States, right? You never really said, well, actually, I'm a naturalized citizen, so I actually did assent to be a to be part of the compact. But when you are born in the United States and your parents are Americans, and you grow up, you never really assent to be part of the United States. So basically, I think that obviously the founders, again, they're not dumb. They thought about this, and they basically said, well, when you uh, everybody has a right to emigrate to another country or another place. You have a right. This is a natural right. You have a natural right to emigrate. Therefore, if you choose to stay, you're basically saying, yes, you agree to the compact. You agree to be part of this society. You agree to be part of this government in a sense, and to abide by the laws that have been provided for your protection. And so, in a sense, that's how you form part of the compact, in that you're choosing to stay here rather than leaving. It's called tacit consent.
Yeah, and you do have a right to leave. If membership is determined by consent, then there should be a natural right to depart. Society, if it has no need of your presence or of your services, children of citizens are automatically offered citizenship, as we know, but they don't have to take it. Right? Consent has to be given at the age of legitimacy, and you can do that either, tacitly, or I don't know. Did they have, oaths? I think some places may have had oaths of allegiance at one point. Uh, but the principle there is probably the most important one, which is that you are not bound to anything that you have not consented to in some way. And you can consent in various ways. The way that you continually express consent is through ongoing elections.
Right.
You can vote in a representative to change the law. That representative can even go so far as to amend the Constitution. So, in that way, if you don't like a country, well, you could try to do your part to change it in those ways that are pre-established. But if nothing works, if nothing gives, you have the right to leave. Of course,
There's a bunch of yeah, there's a
no one has the obligation to take you once you leave,
right,
though. So
yeah,
keep that in mind.
yeah. And there's a lot of people that always you see them on TV. They threaten that if a certain person wins the election, that they're gonna leave the country. Yes, they have the right to leave, and sometimes we hope that they would, but they don't. A lot of people are asking in the chat about the books that I was referencing. Uh, there's two books that I again really encourage you to buy them or read them. Vindicating the Founders by Dr. West is one of them, and also by Dr. West is the political theory of the American founding. If for no other reason, he quotes the founders so much that it should serve like a reference guide for the founding. Um, so um, somebody was asking about that, so I just wanted to bring that up. The other question then Gene asked, which followed from the idea of consent to be part of the compact, goes to the Civil War, because he says, and it's a really good question. He says, if the South believed it was no longer represented, didn't it have the same rights to cast off the government as the colonists did? It is in the nature of governments to attempt to prevent themselves, but if that nature is unconstitutional, is it unlawful to undertake it? While states shouldn't be able to just to leave the Union on a whim, at the same time was the entire Civil War based on a disregard of the principles of the founding? I think that's a really good question because, well, my answer is no. Uh, they didn't have the right to leave, and I think the key is when you said states shouldn't be able to just leave the Union on a whim. So if you remember in the Declaration of Independence, the founders say that it's a long train of abuses, right? It is a constant violation of rights that gives you that right to uh, break the allegiances that you have to a government. And if you are going to break those allegiances, you need to understand that there are going to be consequences. Now, why didn't the states have the right to secede? I would recommend, obviously, reading a guy that's much smarter than I. If you Lincoln is really good on this question. If you go read his Peoria address or his first inaugural or his Cooper Union speech, those are three speeches that he gives where he lays out um, the argument for why secession is not valid, is not legal. And basically, the argument is if you're forming a compact, a contract, so the states are actually forming a compact in which they decide to become part of the union, like all contracts, one side of the contract can't simply say we're no longer, we're simply choosing not to be part of this contract anymore. All parties would have to be in agreement. So I guess if all the states in the north would have said, okay, yeah, you can break the contract, we consent to you leaving the union, then I guess that would have made it um, legitimate. I think so. But since one side or several of the parties in the contract disagreed with breaking the contract, then that's why the secession of the South was illegitimate.
Yeah. I think someone, Mr. Chandler, asked the question, what do you do if you don't recognize, the authority of your state or of the federal government? And going back to the state of nature idea, well, in that case, you actually put yourself back into the state of nature where the government no longer recognize, uh, because that's where everyone starts off, right? So if you decide to leave the social compact, but you nevertheless remain in that territory, it you are outside of it, right? For better or for worse. So I just wanted to tack that on since it
Yeah,
came up.
and one of the things about the state of nature also is you'll hear a lot of people say, well, that's just a theoretical thing. That's when Locke was talking about it, or Hobbes, or all of the political philosophers, they're really talking about it just in a theoretical sense. Like suppose there would be this place, but the founders actually thought that that was a thing that you were in if you did not have a government, and there is actually instances in Massachusetts where a few group of people after the revolution, they considered themselves to be in a state of nature, and they said, we're no longer going to be abiding by rules that are coming from far away because we are in a state of nature and we no longer need to abide by those rules. So they actually considered it to be a real state. Um, and I don't know if there's any other. Oh, I did want to mention one thing,
Mm.
and that's um, when we talk about the founders and what they viewed, and we're presenting these things as the founders said this or the founders believed this, we're talking about the things that they agreed with. Um, so obviously, if you look specifically at Madison or Hamilton or Jefferson or Franklin, there's tons of things that they disagreed with. But the way you look at the founding in general is you look at the things that they agreed with. And how do you know that there's things that they agreed with? Well, because they ratified constitutions, they signed the Declaration of Independence. Every state has its own constitution. It's not just the federal constitution. So if you look at all those official documents in which people came together and said, okay, what are the things that we actually agree with, then those things, that's what we're saying when we say, the founders uh, say this or the founders say that. We're trying to talk about what their consensus was, not their specific disagreements that they might have had with each other.
Yeah, and the consensus as is expressed in the main public documents too. Private letters can be kind of revealing sometimes because people will elaborate on something that they've said, but they usually have uh, private thoughts rather than public consensus, right? So Jefferson in private, um, you know, very skeptical of Christianity, but in public, Jefferson was always very respectful of Christianity because that was the consensus. Right? And the consensus is what's really interesting because the consensus is what made the nation itself great, right? It's the ideas that actually led to the security, the prosperity. Jefferson's ideas are interesting, but they just kind of tell you more about Jefferson. We're interested in the country, right, in its history and how it got to be the way it is now.
And I'm just typing in, somebody was asking that if I can type in the references for the books that we're referencing because they weren't able to write them down. So I think this will do it. There it is. So that's one of the books we're referencing, and I'll put in the other one afterwards to give you guys some time to write it down if you wish. And then we're probably coming close to the end. I don't want to keep you guys. We don't want to keep you guys too long. But the one thing that was being discussed in the discussion board that I wanted to bring up was the subject of a living constitution. Uh, and I want to bring that up because I felt like there was a misunderstanding on what people mean when they talk about a living constitution in the discussion board. And so I wanted to clarify that. Some people were mentioning that what a living constitution means is um, the amendment process, that you can amend the constitution and change things in the constitution, and that's why it's called the living constitution, because as time goes by, you know, the 17th amendment, we no longer allow legislate the state legislatures to elect senators, but now it's by popular vote, or like that with all the other um, amendments. But that's not actually what scholars and justices mean when they talk about the living constitution. Um, One of the leading constitutional scholars of our time, is David Strauss, and he's a big proponent of this idea of a living constitution. And he juxtaposes his idea of a living constitution with originalism. And so specifically, he goes after Scalia, Thomas, and Bork. Um, and so what he says, the living constitution is basically a common law approach to the constitution, meaning there's no written common law is really there's no written document as a constitution. It's just that laws keep being passed, but then they're changed, so it's much more flexible. Um, so the living constitution is a common law approach to the constitution, rooted in the written document, but also based on precedent. This is what David Strauss says. Each generation has contributed precedents that guide and confine judicial rulings, yet allow us to meet the demands of today, not force us to follow the commands of the long dead founders. So he explores how judicial decisions adapted the Constitution's text and contradicted original intent to produce some of our most profound accomplishments. So basically, what he's saying is we don't care about original intent when in the living Constitution. You don't care what is it that the founders meant when they wrote, um, Article 1 or Article 2. Or even if you look at the 14th Amendment, it doesn't matter what they meant when they said every citizen born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That doesn't matter. What matters is how we understand it today and how the court has interpreted in the past, 100 years. That's what matters, and that's what a living constitution is. So that's something to keep in mind, that difference. That when we're talking about, obviously, we all believe that the Constitution can be amended. There's a process for that, and that's because the founders thought, there's some things that are going to have to be changed in time. A great example is the 12th Amendment. They quickly realized that the process that they had put to elect the president and vice president was having problems. So they changed it right away with the 12th Amendment, and I think it's 1804 or something like that.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and they agreed in principles. That's what's meant by consensus. They didn't always agree on policy, right? Because there's this famous dispute between Jefferson and Hamilton on whether or not an industrial economy or an agrarian economy should be the preferred economy for the United States. There was a disagreement on policy, but on principle, both of them were entirely on board with everything that you listen to in lectures 1 and 2. That government is um, that government is there to protect your rights. That it's formed on the basis of consent. And that and yes, that you do have the right to abolish government if it isn't protecting you. Right.
and I just went ahead and put that other book that we were referencing right now. That if you want to know everything you would need to know about the founding, I think that would be the book to
Enough.
go to.
Yeah,
Yep.
that would be enough.
Yeah, this one's a little more dense. It's a little more difficult, I think, to get through. Um, anyway, I think we've said everything that we were wanting to say. I don't know if you had anything else. We've covered most of the major topics that were discussed. in the discussion board and in the questions that were emailed to us. Um, so I don't know if do you have anything else?
I do have some questions, but we can also just answer them by email or at the discussion board. I think those were the ones that we chose to focus on because they were the ones that came up most frequently, like something tied to all of those: living constitution, the meaning of equality, um, tying back to the state of nature. So we don't have all the time in the world, so we try to focus on the big things, and hopefully we'll get to some of the more factual questions and the ones that are more particular to you over the course of the week.
Yeah, and feel free to email us about, what you thought of this, what we can do better, how we can better answer your questions. Somebody was asking Hillsdale documentation. I don't know if Hillsdale as an institution officially has a stance, but I would say every professor here is very much an originalist. We believe the document was, there was an intention behind it when it was written, and when we interpret it, we should try to understand what that intent was. Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a question of what other countries' governing documents most closely resembles ours. I hear Hades is is very close to ours, but it doesn't work so well there, I suppose.
That's actually a great point, right? A constitution depends on a people to uphold it. That is key, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because you need to understand that a constitution is just a piece of paper. It depends on the people to uphold it. The famous line from Benjamin Franklin, when coming out of the Constitutional Convention, this lady asks us, "Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And he responds, "A republic, if you can keep it." That's very true. And that's why um, lectures like this, and taking courses like this are important, because it's up to you guys to make sure that it's upheld, and that it keeps on. Anyway,
Yeah,
I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope this was helpful to you, and that some things were clarified. Um, Again, if you have questions for lectures 3 and 4, that is next Thursday, email them, put them up on the discussion board, and we'll be sure to try to answer them. Thanks so
all right,
much.
yeah, thanks.
See you next week.
See you.